For those of you that are signing on, you've come to the right place. This is our education town hall, where we're going to be giving an update on what's happening provincially and at the City of Toronto level on education for elementary students and middle school and high school students. We will be starting in a few minutes. And if we're going to be keeping the chat open, right, Sarah? So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we can collect them and ask our panelists as we go through the agenda. Okay, well, I'm going to start off with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And our area is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. For those of you that are signing on, this is our Education Town Hall. We are hosting this town hall in the middle of budget season. The Toronto District School Board has just come out with their budget, and the provincial government has just come out with their budget. And these two processes really have a huge impact on the quality of education that our kids received. I have 2 kids in the public school system. I get to see firsthand the impact of the government's priorities on the quality of education that my kids get and what their peers get. And as the MPP for this area, I regularly talk to the schools, the school board trustee, the parents, and we're getting we get a pretty good understanding of what's working and also what's not working. And the purpose of the town hall tonight is to give you all an update on what we know and what we don't know, and also an opportunity for you to ask questions and provide comments and learn about what we can do to take action to improve our public schools. I am joined by 4 excellent people, and I'm going to introduce them in turn. And the first person I'd like to introduce is Chandra Pasma. Chandra is the Ontario NDP's education critic. And I want to start off with you and ask you a really high-level question. You know, what is this government, this Conservative government's overall approach to schools?
Thanks, Jess, and good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you for this important conversation. This is, as Jessica said, an important time for publicly funded education in Ontario. And unfortunately, what we have right now is a government that does not believe in publicly funded education, and so has been systematically underfunding our public education system and refusing to provide the kinds of supports and resources that would ensure that every child in Ontario has what they need to be successful in school. They have significantly cut the level of funding when you take into account inflation. So on a per student basis, the government is providing $1,357 less for each student in Ontario compared to what education funding was in 2018. That's a lot of money per student. It's even more money when you add it up over the whole province. That's $2.7 billion less for our education system in Ontario. And for the TDSB alone, if funding had just kept pace with inflation since 2018, they would have $320 million more this year to spend in their budget. And you can imagine, you know, what that would mean in terms of educational assistants and child and youth workers and social workers and lunchroom supervisors and English language learning teachers, that kind of funding would provide and the difference that it would make for our schools. And instead, we see school boards across the province, like the TDSB, being forced to make incredibly painful cuts, choosing which students are going to miss out on which incredibly important resources, trying to figure out how to stretch the resources that they have as far as they can go to provide kids with the supports that they need. And it's really that our kids that are paying the price for this at the end of the day. I have a couple examples. One of the most glaring examples of this is in special education. The government funds literally so little of the cost of special education in Ontario that boards have deficits of tens of millions of dollars in special education costs. And that's for a system in which kids are still not getting enough support to be safe at school, let alone to be able to learn. And so we have incredibly concerning rates of violence in our schools, but also situations where students are leaving school property, students with severe disabilities, and schools aren't even aware because they don't have the staff members to be with these students at all times. I've also heard some stories from principals and teachers about principals having to take children with disabilities or special needs around the school with them all day, you know, the principal pulling a little red wagon with a student in it, because the principal is the only one left to keep an eye on this child and try to keep them safe throughout the day. You know, these are some of our most vulnerable learners, and they're paying the biggest price. But we also see it with mental health. We have a mental health crisis in our schools, and yet 95% of schools say they need more support for mental health than what they're getting. Half of schools have no regularly scheduled access to a mental health professional at all. And so we're seeing an outbreak of violence because kids are not getting the supports and the resources that they need. And that means higher levels of injuries to teachers and education workers and to other students. And what we have in the budget this year is the government put $30 million towards surveillance cameras and vape detectors. So there's no money for educational assistants, no money for additional teachers, no money for child and youth workers or social workers to address the mental health crisis. So apparently we are just going to watch the violence as it takes place in our schools instead of actually doing something about it. And that's just the, you know, tip of the iceberg. That's two examples. There's no support for lifelong learners, for students who need extra support to get to the finish line, for students who left school before they finished but have real life experience that could be put towards a high school diploma. There's no support for ESL students. There's no support for after school and summer activities that are incredibly important to kids, and within our communities give kids options for after school, things that get them involved in community engagement, give them a healthy outlet for their emotions, and make sure that they're not getting involved in any kind of violent activities. You know, there's no support. We have cut the system to the bare bone. We don't even have qualified teachers in all our classrooms. So that's the state of education under Stephen Lecce and Doug Ford in Ontario, sadly.
Ooh. Thank you, Chandra. I would like to, my next question is to the MPP for Toronto Centre, Kristyn Wong-Tam, who is co-hosting this event for you all. Kristyn, what are you hearing from your residents about the state of schools in Toronto Centre?
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that question. It's a pretty important one, and obviously why we're all here. And I just want to say thank you to all the attendees who joined us, and as well as the panelists. You're all giving us your time very freely. Our education critic, Chandra Pasma, I think has been really quite blunt and honest about what we're seeing in education. And I think that if I take her comments and distill that to what's happening in Toronto Centre, which is a neighbor of obviously University of Rosedale, I can pretty much say that everything that she's saying is lived experience now in our communities. And the lived experience for a lot of the teachers is that they're overworked. The morale is extremely low. For parents, they are definitely struggling, especially if they have students, children, I should say, with special needs. The classrooms are feeling crowded. And other things that have come to my attention repeatedly, and my wonderful trustee Dee William, our wonderful trustee Dee William can confirm this, is that there's a constant ask of the community for more community supports so that they can address the rising violence in the schools. So it's not just student-on-student violence, because that is definitely on the rise, but it's also violence in the classrooms attacking teachers, and you may have some disruptive behavior coming from one student who really needs more time and attention, and they're not getting the support and help that they need. In some other instances, I'm hearing about parents who are really quite angry about the fact that the capital facilities are not being well maintained. So we're not seeing a lot of new funding with respect to addressing the capital backlog. So not only are we not building new schools, as despite the fact we've got a growing population, the schools that we have are also aging. And if there was ever a lesson that we learned, is that during the COVID pandemic, everyone was scrambling for air filters and air purifiers, and it really was alarming to see how ill-equipped the education ministry was on trying to even deal with health-related pandemic responses. Everybody was struggling, but I felt that the Ministry of Education really dropped the ball on making sure that our students were safe and healthy, and that the teachers and the education workers, the social workers in the schools, plus the administrators and the principals were to be supported. And the other things that I can share is that stories about the struggling parents because of the cost of living is that parents really don't have a lot of anything left over. So any type of additional support that if the school was able to sort of meet them where they need to be met with respect to nutrition and education programs, meaning snacks, something as simple as that, making sure that adequate breakfast programs are everywhere and accessible where they need to be. I would think that at this point in time, we now need to start thinking about lunch programs, just because students are hungry. They literally cannot take care of themselves if their parents don't have a lot of food. And I'm hearing that in my communities, especially with the low-income communities, that this is a massive problem. So not to depress everybody, I'm excited about getting to the solutions and how to get parents and everyone who's on this call involved. But I know that our fight is real. But also I know that together as a community, our voices are stronger when we're united. So thank you very much, Jessica.
Thank you, Kristyn. For those of you that have questions, please post them in the chat and we'll collect them. We are starting with some overall questions and questions that people have submitted through the RSVP process, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So please put them in the chat. Dee Williams is the school board trustee for the Toronto Centre area and the University Rosedale area. Dee, we know that the Toronto District School Board is facing a deficit and is having to make some pretty tough decisions about this coming year. Can you tell us what's happening at the TDSB?
Dee, you're on mute.
You have to mute.
You know, that was the meme of the pandemic, and I should know. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us this evening. Thank you to all of my fellow panelists. So at the Toronto District School Board, you know, we are facing quite a substantial deficit, looking at a $26.2 million deficit at this point. And, you know, I'm throwing that number out there at the beginning just to give you a sense of the magnitude. But behind all of the numbers and data you hear are actual people, like the students, their families, the education workers, the teachers, the staff. You know, it all boils down to the core of why we're all here. And it's for our public education system to really support the improved achievement and well-being of all of our kids, so they have like the best possible outcome for each child. This budget cycle has been, you know, as difficult as the ones in the past. The proposals the staff had been making to balance the budget resulted in a lot of community engagement. In particular, some of the continuing education programs, the Learn for Life, we heard from so many seniors who express that these programs are not just, you know, a special interest, program. It goes like way beyond that. It really is a lifeline. It engages them with their community. It helps them form a sense of community, a sense of belonging, as well as the skills that are learned. And that's, to some, may seem like a frill. The core of what we're supposed to be doing at this public school board is kindergarten to grade 12. But we all know our schools go beyond that. They really should be community hubs. We've heard that time and time again over the years. It should go from preschool, childcare, to the seniors with the programs that give them that sense of community and belonging and meaningful, a meaningful contribution to their community. So as others have mentioned, the Toronto District School Board, we do invest beyond the funding that we receive from the province in special education, in safety and community supports. An example is I'm the school board trustee for 2 city wards, University Rosedale and Toronto Centre. Coming out of the pandemic, there was like a real need for attention to mental health. There were safety concerns across our city. And as a result, the Toronto District School Board struck a reference panel. And one of the first things that came out of that reference panel was a safety table for Regent Park. There is such a need and importance for the proper investment, the real funding that we need to support all of our schools, all of our students, to keep those class sizes low and reasonable. Like a kindergarten class of 34, kindergarten students, that's not reasonable. We need the proper funding from the province. And folks listening here may or may not know that the Toronto District School Board doesn't have a revenue stream. All of our funding comes from the province. The province holds the purse. So I lay it on the feet of the minister, Stephen Lecce, to come through for our students and our communities. Recently, at a special board meeting, one of the motions that was passed unanimously by our board was asking the minister to lift the moratorium for schools, which would allow TDSB to consolidate some of our sites to better utilize our schools. Some of them are really under-enrolled and some of them are over capacity. We need to right-size our schools. I see in the news media that the response has come back, that the minister is saying, I've given 120 million more to the Toronto District School Board and enrollment is down. Well, we need to dig deeper into that. In fact, you've heard from our MPP, Pasma, earlier, that actually funding for public education has gone down, year after year. So it's not keeping pace with inflation. There are costs that are not funded by the ministry that the board incurs. So, just to give you like an overview, we are simply we don't have the funding needed from the Ministry of Education to support our schools as they should be. So those are my initial comments. Folks can dig deeper into the data and the numbers, but behind all of the data and the numbers are real people, students, their families, our education workers, teachers, staff. It's real people behind all of these. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. I'd like to introduce Helen Victoros. Helen is the president of the Elementary Teachers of Toronto. Thanks for joining us, Helen. My question to you is, what are teachers telling you that they're seeing in their classrooms, and what is ETT advocating for?
Thanks so much, Jessica, and to all the panelists that have come before me. I'm listening, and everything that you're saying is resonating so powerfully tonight. I also want to thank all of the people that are here at this forum. So I represent almost 11,000 members, ETT members, who are elementary teachers in almost 500 sites across the Toronto District School Board. And Dee, what you were saying just at the end of your speech about the fact that, you know, behind the numbers that we're talking about, Chandra, you talked about 2.7 billion in cuts since the Ford government came to power, that there are real people, our teachers, DECEs, caretaking staff, students. I want to take my time to actually just share with you what I'm hearing from teachers. I want to share with you a story that I heard from a teacher recently. She wrote to me and said, "I'm a kindergarten teacher. I've got a number of years experience behind me. I work with an ECE, and I was doing really well with a group of 23 students, which consisted of 5 students who have ESL needs, a student with behavioral needs, 2 students that have autism, and a student who right now is nonverbal, has engaged in a number of violent incidents since the beginning of the school year, needs physical assistance to come in and out of the classroom and put on clothing, and has hurt other children, like choking other children." I'm a really strong teacher, and I've worked in a number of different settings prior to working in the TDSB with children who have autism. So this isn't new to me, but I am finding it a real struggle to achieve anything for the remainder of my 26 students in a typical classroom. I've been working really hard to receive support in the classroom outside of the ECE, because we can't work with the classroom alone, specifically with our one student who really needs additional support and help. And then in January, I received an additional 6 students who have ESL needs, and the numbers seem to be growing weekly as we have been receiving a number of students who are refugees. I have been upset every day. I am finding that I can't take the stress any longer, and I really need to rethink what I'm doing right now in teaching. Let me know what I should do. So that's the story of what's happening in our schools right now. We have teachers. Our teachers, I think, are dealing with simultaneously a lot of anger at the situation that exists in their schools right now, and a lot of guilt almost simultaneously, because they want so desperately to be able to meet the needs of all of their students, and they lack the resources and supports to do it. And I heard a little while ago somebody describe, and they were talking specifically about healthcare workers, this concept of moral injury, that when you struggle very hard every day to meet needs, whether you're working in the healthcare sector or public education, and you see what needs to be done, and you're denied the resources to be able to do it, the impact on you as a teacher, as an ECE, as an educational assistant, is enormous. And we see that impact every day and growing. We see the number of our members that are dealing with the incredible stress of not being able to meet the needs, and not because the money doesn't exist, We just saw, another provincial budget where we had $8 billion transferred again in corporate tax cuts. The same thing happened last year. So we see a government that is making decisions every single day about where they'll actually put their resources. But it is morally injurious. And when I go into schools, I always ask the same question of the teachers that I meet with. If you could change 3 things tomorrow that would make things immediately better for you, your colleagues, your students, snap your fingers. Money's no object. Dream big. Please don't say more paper towels in the washroom. We're blue skying it here. What would you do immediately? And the answers are always the same. And I always feel like, if we had parents in the room with us as well, and the majority of our members are actually parents too, we'd hear the exact same responses. So the first 2 answers are always more special education supports and smaller class sizes, especially in kindergarten and in the junior intermediate grades. We've got kindergarten classes of 32 students. We have junior intermediate classes of 36 students. They talk about more ESL support, more guidance counselors, librarians, music and the arts. They talk about more mental health supports, meaningful professional development, and the time to actually engage in it. Up-to-date technology for themselves and every single one of their students. School supplies. They actually want to be able to provide the pencils, the pens, the duotangs, the paper for all of their students that require it, instead of having to penny pinch and triage paper at the photocopier. They want fixes to their school so that the children don't think that the mouse in the room is actually a pet. And they want more staff. I think one of the most important things is more human resources to be able to meet the needs. And when we talk about that, it's we have a group of 30 teachers in the room that are putting out, if I could have anything I want, this is what I would want. And we build this beautiful vision of what a strong public education system would look like. And I always say, if we had, parents, members of our community around the school sitting here listening to you talk about what you would want in your schools, 100% everybody would agree with you. And everything that you've said is entirely reasonable. It is entirely reasonable. It should already exist. And we just need to go after, we need to organize together to go after the investments to make this happen, because it should already happen in a province as rich as Ontario. And I will stop speaking now because I've been talking for a little while, but I'm really excited to talk about next steps and what we do to actually get the investments to create this beautiful vision of a strong public education system that we all want. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. It's the government does they try so hard to divide parents and teachers and students. They try so hard because they know that when parents and teachers and students work together, we can accomplish so much.
Absolutely.
That last question, that last point that you made is the first question I want to ask each of you. And that question is, what can we do to pressure the Premier and the Conservative government to improve our schools? What tactically can we do? And I'd like to ask each of you this question, and if you could just be brief, because most of the questions I'll just ask 1 or 2 of you, but this is so important. What can we do? I want to start with that. And Helen, I'd like to start with you.
Oh, okay. Tactically, it's for me, it's always the same answer. It is what has already started to happen, and we've got many incredible organizers that are here right now. It's bringing people together in bigger and bigger numbers, and targeting, I would say, specifically the Tory MPPs in Toronto, to bring pressure on them now to be accountable for what they're doing to public education, and to say there is more than enough for all of us, and to demand the funding to actually have the schools that we deserve. So coming together, I know that there are some petition campaigns that are happening, and also to strengthen. So I know the trustees are doing amazing work right now, looking and scrounging for the money. But, you know, I want to say some of the things that we're hearing as the board goes through this process, they're really, you know, we've got a lot of blaming teacher language that's happening right now. So instead of looking at what's actually happening with the province's underfunding, we're seeing a lot of language around teacher absenteeism. And it is also, I have a bit of a visceral reaction to the discussion around closing schools. Just have always had a reaction to that. I would want to go at, like, target the government to go after the funding.
Thank you, Helen. MPP Wong-Tam, what can we do to pressure this government?
Well, thanks, Jessica. I mean, I think we all know that the tactics that we've used have oftentimes been about crowdsourcing all of us together to either be in one place to push the government by asking questions in question period, or the targeting of conservative-held MPP ridings. I think those are all great. I'm wondering, you know, these days, as we all have limited bandwidth, and I am thinking about the poor parents. And I'm thinking about myself as a poor parent as well. It's like, you know, what energy do I have, and what powers are within my control where I can go off and do it. And it does feel like, you know, one by one is simply not enough, but our collective power is so much better. So I want to throw out two of them, two ideas that I haven't discussed this necessarily in big groups, but I'm just going to talk about it because we're a friendly crowd. First of all, student teacher family-led walkouts. It's like a day of action, not just at Queen's Park, but, you know, around the MPP's office, where people are invited to basically just leave the classroom for X number of hours, and we do it together. I'm sure there's some liability issues, but quite honestly, the stakes are so high. The other one is it worthwhile to investigate a class action lawsuit? Because students and families have the right to education. That is, you know, there are certain inherent rights and human rights that are enshrined in the charter, and the fact that the government is breaching that access point, perhaps some bright legal minds can guide us on whether or not there's something there for us to explore. And then, of course, all the other usual tricks that we have.
Mm-hmm. We are taking notes. MPP Passma.
So we've seen a few examples of what works with this government, because they've reversed themselves on a number of things, like the Greenbelt. But one of them was the CUPE education strike, when the government tried to legislate away the constitutional rights of CUPE education workers to negotiate their salaries and working conditions. And what was successful, I mean, the government backed down like over the course of a weekend, because teachers and parents and grandparents and blue collar workers and private sector workers and public sector workers all stood together and said, this is wrong, we're not going to stand for it. And it's that kind of solidarity that we've seen on other issues where the government has backed down. That's the kind of solidarity we need to have on this issue. And Stephen Lecce is so bad for trying to divide everyone. You know, he's blaming the teachers for the teacher shortage. He's blaming the school boards for the underfunding and the fact that school boards have to make cuts. He's blaming the school boards for the transportation issues. He's blaming the education workers for special education shortfalls. And, you know, he's trying to tell parents, none of this is my responsibility. It's their fault. And we can't allow ourselves to be divided in that way. We need school board trustees to stand with teachers and education workers and principals and administrators and parents and grandparents and just interested community members to say, no, we know this is on the government. They are not providing the funding. They are not providing the environment in which public education can succeed. I wholeheartedly agree with the suggestion to talk to your Toronto area MPPs. To let them know, you know, what their game is, and to demand that the government put forward the funding. That's incredibly important. But another thing that you can do is to have a conversation with your fellow parents, with your neighbors, so that they understand that this is the game that the government is playing. And we don't allow the government spin, which is a nice way of saying lies, to convince people that it is the school board's fault or the teacher's fault, that as much as possible, we are building this common understanding that it is the government's underfunding that is the root cause of the problem.
Thank you to all of you. I want to, this next question is, I'm going to, it's a comment and a question that's come in. One is a comment about how the Conservative government in Ontario amalgamated a number of school boards and they took away any power of local boards to raise their own funds through property taxes, making them entirely dependent on funding from the provincial government. And then the second question, there's a comment. And then the second question that was in this is, you know, our property taxes keep going up. They get funneled up to the province, and then that funding goes to partially fund our schools. And the question this individual had is, you know, why is it that property taxes keep going up, but the investment in schools per capita continues to drop? You know, what's going on with property taxes and our schools? Kristyn, would you like to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, so I don't think
pass it on if you want.
Yeah, you know, I think I'm going to let our education critic take a stab at that first, and then I'll come in and give you what I think I've seen as a former city councillor.
Thanks, Kristyn. So there's a couple things to know for context. One is that the provincial government has overall cut their sources of revenue. You know, it's come in the form of corporate tax cuts. It's also come in the form of smaller things like the elimination of the license plate renewal fee. But overall, the provincial government is collecting less revenue than they were previously, which means that they have to stretch the existing revenue sources farther. And the education property tax is just one of those revenue sources. Like we just had the budget 2 weeks ago, and in the list of government revenue, you see the quantity coming in from education property tax, which is just going into general revenues and then, you know, being parceled out along with other revenues. As to why it's increasing, but the funding for public education is going down, it's because the government is prioritizing other things and does not at all prioritize publicly funded education. And, you know, unfortunately, there's no requirement that they do prioritize publicly funded education. We just really need to put the public pressure on them so that they will.
Kristyn?
Yeah, and thank you. So I was hoping to hear that answer, Chandra, because that's a big piece of what we're seeing. I also think that what's absolutely critical is that the school boards have been in many ways, I mean, we all know systematically and purposefully defunded, and so they've created a remarkable dynamic where everyone is pitted against one another in almost like the Hunger Games fashion. So cities need more. TDSB and school boards need more. Cities and TDSB and all school boards should be working together to create these magnificent ecosystems around the community hubs that we all keep talking about. But there's more and more pressure on schools and educators to do more, because also cities themselves are being forced to remove some services. So unless you have a progressive council that's fighting very hard to make sure that they continue to meet the needs of citizens, some of that falls back onto schools, which is why we have these continuing education programs. There's all these extracurricular activities and all these other programs that meet the needs of the broad continuum of education. The solution to that is making sure that everyone can sit down in equal partnership and work out a new deal. And so cities have been asking the province for a new deal. School boards need to do the same thing.
Good point. The next question I have is around clean air. We've had 2 questions come in on this topic. One is, what are school boards doing to prioritize cleaning the air in classrooms? And can we get an update on 2 indoor air quality bills, Bill 140 and Bill 86, that are going through the legislature to mandate cleaner air within our classrooms? Chandra, I think that this is a question for you.
Thanks, Jessica. So the short answer is that the government is doing nothing on indoor air quality. During the pandemic, they did put some funding towards upgrades in ventilation. Obviously not enough, as is the pattern with this government. But part of the bigger problem is that they didn't put in place any standards for air quality or ventilation. There's no requirement for measuring and reporting. So we really have no idea what's going on in schools. And we know from studies that are done elsewhere that just because you have the latest ventilation equipment doesn't mean it's properly installed, that it's properly repaired, that it's working properly. So we actually don't know what the air quality is in our schools unless parents are sneaking air quality monitors into their kids' backpack, because you're not even supposed to be doing that. So parents kind of have to do it on the down low. So we've tabled this bill 140, the Improving Air Quality for Our Children Act, which would require the government to actually have measurement and reporting of air quality in classrooms, along with an action plan of measures that would need to be taken if air quality is at unsafe levels. And air quality, of course, affects so much more than the spread of infectious diseases. It also affects morale, absenteeism, and cognitive. It has cognitive effects. So students do better when the air quality is better. So, a minister who keeps talking about test outcomes should really want to invest in air quality so we bring up students' test results. But it's just not on the radar for the government at all. And in terms of where it is on the timeline, so because it's private members' business, we each get a date to bring forward a bill, and I do not have one at this time. So I don't know when it will come for debate or if it will come for debate before the next election. The government could bring it forward at any time. And so, if this is of great concern to you, then I suggest you reach out to Stephen Lecce and suggest that he bring it forward. And lastly, on the question of who's supporting it, I mean, we had very broad support from the teachers' unions, the education workers' unions, the school board associations. I would say all the partners in education agree that we need this in Ontario, except for the provincial government.
Good summary. This next question is
Oh.
sorry.
So,
Sorry, Kristyn.
go ahead, Helen.
I wanted to just add one thing. So we are in local bargaining right now, and the last couple of rounds we have brought forward language that talks about having HEPA filters, up-to-date filtration systems in good working order through every workspace, worksite, classroom across the Toronto District School Board, as well as a heat stress plan, which is the other issue that can really have an impact on both our students as well as our members. So I wanted to say, we have many tools. And, one of the tools for us is collective bargaining, and we use collective bargaining to fight for the common good for things like that. So we are advocating strongly for that with the TDSB right now.
Thank you, Helen. I just wanted to add, because Bill 86 is my bill, and specifically to protect Ontario's people and the economy from the next pandemic, because we all know it's not a matter of if, but matter when. So my bill is a little bit broader. It's actually taking a look at all non-residential infrastructure, including workplaces, and of course businesses and places where we conduct commerce. And I specifically brought in that bill because I knew that businesses who had faced these extraordinary long days of shutdown, they were the ones who were most eager to see a bill like that come into effect so that they can avoid the next 500 days of rounds of shutdown. There is one opportunity that has not been widely explored, and that is galvanizing the business community to support pandemic prevention bills like this one, because they are highly motivated to make sure that any type of new infrastructure that is built, any type of retrofits, to build to the highest standard to actually have better air quality. So why I share that is that it's not just teachers and educators and unions and school boards that are interested in high quality air controlled environment. It's actually businesses. So that means there is the possibility for two significant stakeholders coming together in partnership on this one.
Thank you. This next question is for Chandra. Chandra, This person has asked, is there a relationship between TDSB funding and the Ontario Autism Program? If so, how does this relation work towards funding ABA therapy and other special needs and autism and ABA programs in public schools?
Very good question. So there's not a direct relationship, given the changes that the Conservatives have made to the Ontario Autism Program, which has completely broken it. Let's be honest about that. It has been sending funding to families to pay for services for their child. There are over 60,000 kids now who are on the wait list for that funding, who are not getting any kind of support or therapy at all unless their parents are able to pay for it out of pocket, and then they are getting only what their families can afford. And so those kids are going to our schools without any kind of therapy or supports that would actually help them to succeed there. And that's one of the things that's driving some of this shortfall in special education funding, that when kids don't get any kind of therapy or any kind of support that helps them to be ready at school, that helps them to be safe at school, then their needs are much greater once they're at school. And unfortunately, our schools are not funded to provide that level of care. So we see many situations where students need one-on-one support, or even more than one-on-one support, just to keep them safe at school. Not even to, get into whether or not they have the supports to be learning. And yet school boards don't have the resources to provide them with one-on-one support. We're seeing more and more school boards eliminate congregate classes, which are small classes for students with disabilities or learning exceptionalities, because they're very expensive, and that's a way to try to save funds when you need to eliminate things. But these children are then being mainstreamed in classes where they don't have supports they need for them to succeed. And we're also seeing a situation where there are so few educational assistants for our schools that EAs are running from student to student with a walkie-talkie in their hand after a crisis has already occurred, and they're trying to intervene once the child is already frustrated or violent or has escaped, instead of being with the student all the time, being able to identify what their cues are, when they need a body break, when they're getting frustrated and should be taken out. And so that's one of the contributors to the problem of violence in our schools, that kids don't have the capacity to express themselves the way they might if they had therapy, that they don't have the support to help them avoid frustration or to calm down before they get incredibly frustrated. So this is how we are indirectly paying through our schools for the lack of support for kids with autism.
Thank you. This next question is for, I believe, Dee, and then maybe Chandra. And it's the question around school closures. So the question is, how do we respond to school closures due to low student enrollment? Dee, do you want to start us off?
So that question speaks to the motion that was passed at our special board meeting about asking the Ministry of Education to lift the moratorium, or in the alternative, giving TDSB an exemption. It's really about right-sizing our schools. I know sometimes it's framed as like, we're closing schools, but it's really right-sizing schools and sometimes consolidating where needed. Like for example, a secondary school, if enrollment is like really low, like 300, 400 students, and then we have in another school like overcapacity, there's an opportunity there to find efficiencies and consolidate, and it actually serves the programming and for the students better. Because when you have that zone of like around 1,200 students, you have an opportunity to provide like the breadth of programs that make this school interesting and enriching for the students. When it's underutilized, there's less programming. So that's one thing about the closure of schools, or consolidation. And I know like folks like generally like Helen said, sometimes it's a visceral reaction, you're closing the school. But if you think of it in that way of like consolidating, and it gives also the opportunity for this, this school as a community hub, idea that we keep talking about and we really need to put in practice. It should be like a vibrant place where there's like activity happening from childcare to, continuing education programming for our seniors. So that's what I have to say about the idea of school closures. And I was going to mention something else as well. Um, the ministry used to provide funding um, to offset some of these underutilized schools, which was phased out. Um, I was just looking for the number. There's so many numbers. I think it was 35 million. Just add that back in. And then, there's like a solution right there. Just add that funding back in, that top up that was discontinued. And that would go a long way to supporting our schools.
Maybe Chandra, is it okay? Oh, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, if I can
Okay,
just jump in
yeah.
quickly, I think this really comes down to the funding issue by the province again. If the TDSB had the additional 320 million this year that they would if funding had just kept pace since 2018, I'm not sure we'd be talking about closing schools. As Dee just said, it's really not fair that the government has in place this moratorium, but then cut the funding that was actually provided by the government to cover these schools that have lower enrollment in them. It's just one of a number of examples where the government is requiring schools to do something, but is not providing the funding to actually do it, which means that schools actually have to make cuts to services to students in other areas. But, I'm hearing from a lot of municipalities, including at the Association of Municipalities conference last year, that they really see their schools as community hubs, and they want the right to be able to have community services provided in the school when the school has lower enrollment, and to be able to reclaim that space when the school has higher enrollment. To have a public library in a school, it makes so much sense. And yet the government has refused to even have the conversation and facilitate that kind of partnership. And that's what I think we need to be talking about: adequate funding, and how do we work with our communities to maximize community use of these spaces.
It's an excellent question. I'm the housing critic for our party. And one thing that I get concerned about is there is this very clear mandate coming from the government, which many parties support, which is that we need to increase the number of people who are living in towns and cities by increasing density. And I am very worried when the Ontario government, chooses who is going to live where. It's very primarily led by the free market, and there's no clear coordination at all between what schools exist and where are we asking people to live. And I worry that we are being very short-sighted in this process around, what schools do we want to keep open? What schools do we want to keep to close or consolidate, when we have no real plan of where these people are going to live, because no one's really tracking it. And if we are going to move towards a situation where a school does need to be closed, what I think a lot of residents are very concerned about is that it's going to get turned into a condo of some sort, and that public land is going to be gone for good. When in 15 years' time, we might need to keep that as public land and reopen it as a school or turn it into a public library, as MPP Pasma said. And so making rash decisions around what we use with our precious public land in towns and cities might be a good idea.
Can I just add something to that, Jess? Bill 98, which was tabled by this government and adopted last year, which was basically the Stephen Lecce can boss school boards around bill, actually gives the minister the power to order that a school property be sold without the school board's consent, which means that when school boards are trying to hold on to these properties that they think are going to be important to the community down the line, the minister can actually force them to sell it instead.
Yes, very problematic. So we have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to do one more question, then we're going to talk a little bit about next steps. And it's a really specific question, and it's around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. And many of those calls of actions really focused on our school boards and our education system. This is a specific question to the Helen and the elementary teachers of Toronto around what, where are teachers at when it comes to implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's actions, and where's the school board at? Is it?
Yeah, I can start a response to that. That's such a good question. There is always so much work to do. So in 2015, our union endorsed the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and obviously remains very committed to supporting especially the education calls to action. So our unions have created curriculum resources, workshops. We have a dedicated website for teachers to be able to access resources, materials, workshops. The TDSB, I know this is a priority for them as well. A lot of professional development for our members has been geared towards truth and reconciliation and the education calls to action. We, again, in our collective agreement, in our local bargaining submission, we have said to the TDSB, it's so important, for that professional development piece, we want more professional development. Our members are always chomping at the bit, basically, to get the kinds of professional development that would continue their work around decolonization in their schools. And around the commitments in truth and reconciliation. So that's one of our priorities as well in local bargaining, to have that kind of professional development provided. Yeah, so I hope that answers some of the question.
Thank you very much
for that question.
So we're at time. So I want to conclude with a few closing remarks. One is that we've started the budget process, and it's going to continue for the next probably 3, maybe a month. And what we're really looking for is the Grants for Student Needs announcement, which essentially determines how much funding each individual school and how much funding the school board gets. I also want to thank all of you for being here. There's no question that every single person here deeply cares about improving the quality of the education that our kids receive. For us to improve our kids' education, we really need to organize, work together, and get informed. So I have a few requests. One, even if you've done it already, please send a message to the Minister of Education, Stephen Lecce, calling for the government to invest in public education. They need to continuously hear from you. Number 2, if there are actions that you are interested in participating in, or that you're organizing yourselves, please let us know, because then we can do our best to share it with other people, amplify, promote it, get more people to come out. Just give us an email and we know how to do our outreach. And then number 3, and that's from a rally to a walkout to visiting Queen's Park. The third thing that I think is really important is that please let us know what is happening in your school and in your community, because it helps Chandra and Kristyn and I, it helps us raise these issues in the legislature and in the media, so that people who are not deeply involved in the school system have a better understanding of what is really happening in our schools. And that's part of that education piece that's really critical. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the panelists for being here. I was really interested in what you had to say. I always learn when I listen to you. And I hope you have a good evening, and I look forward to seeing you in the streets.
And a big thank you to you, Jessica Bell.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Good night.